You believe your savings are protected by law, that your retirement account is yours, that the money in your bank is guaranteed, and these beliefs are reasonable because you were taught them by institutions you trusted, by financial advisors and bankers and government officials who assured you that your deposits were insured, that your investments were regulated, that your future was secure. But what if I told you that there are legal mechanisms already in place, tested in other countries, discussed in international financial forums, and quietly embedded in United States law, that allow institutions to take your savings without your consent, without warning, and without compensation, and that these mechanisms aren't theoretical conspiracies, but documented policies that have been used repeatedly throughout modern history, and that understanding these mechanisms is the difference between protecting what you've worked your entire life to build and watching it disappear overnight, while authorities explain that it was necessary, that it was legal, that there was no other choice. This isn't about distant history or foreign countries that have nothing to do with you. This is about the architecture of the financial system you participate in every day, the one that holds your retirement savings, your emergency fund, your life's work converted into numbers on a screen, and those numbers exist within a legal and institutional framework that has far more flexibility than most. People realize flexibility that becomes very relevant when the system faces stress, when banks need liquidity, when governments need to prevent panic, when the choice comes down to protecting your individual property rights or protecting the stability of the system as a whole, and in every single case throughout modern history, the system has chosen itself over you, and it will do so again because the legal precedent has been established, the mechanisms have been tested, and the justification has been rehearsed so many times that when it happens, most people will accept it as inevitable rather than recognizing it as theft. Let me show you how this works by taking you back to a weekend in March of 2013 to the island nation of Cyprus, a small European Union member state in the Mediterranean. And on Friday the 15th of March, Cypriots went to sleep believing their savings were safe, protected by the same European banking regulations that govern Germany and France, insured up to €100,000 per account, guaranteed by law and international treaty. But when they woke up on Saturday morning, they discovered that their government had agreed, under pressure from the European Central Bank and the International Monetary Fund, to confiscate between 6.7 and 9.9% of every bank deposit in the country, not from corporations, not from the wealthy alone, but from every single depositor, including pensioners, small business owners, people who had saved carefully their entire lives. And this wasn't framed as a tax or a fine or a penalty for wrongdoing. It was called a stability levy, a necessary measure to recapitalize failing banks. And the banks were closed that entire weekend, so people couldn't withdraw their money, couldn't protest with their feet, couldn't move their assets to safety. They simply had to wait while politicians and bankers decided how much of their money they would be allowed to keep. Now you might think this was an isolated incident, a peculiar situation in a small country that somehow doesn't apply to larger, more stable nations like the United States. But that's exactly what the people of Cyprus thought before it happened to them. And more importantly, the legal mechanism used in Cyprus, something called a bail-in, was not invented on that weekend in March. It had been developed over years in international financial forums, discussed in Bank for International Settlements, meetings incorporated into banking regulations across the developed world, including the United States, because after the 2008 financial crisis, when governments used taxpayer money to bail out failing banks, there was public outrage, there was political backlash, and policymakers decided that the next time banks failed, they would use a different mechanism. They would bail in the banks using depositor funds rather than bailing them out using government funds. And this isn't speculation. This is documented in the Dodd-Frank Act passed in the United States in 2010, in the language about orderly liquidation authority, in Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation planning documents, in statements from officials explaining how future bank failures would be handled differently than in 2008. The logic seems reasonable on the surface, because why should taxpayers who had nothing to do with risky banking practices be forced to cover the losses? But here's what they don't emphasize when they explain this policy. Your bank deposit isn't actually your property in the legal sense. When you deposit money in a bank, you're not storing your property in a vault. You're making an unsecured loan to the bank, and the bank becomes the legal owner of that money, and you become a creditor of the bank, And in bankruptcy law, creditors get paid according to a hierarchy, and depositors rank below certain other creditors, which means that if a bank fails and needs to be recapitalized, your deposits can be converted to bank equity, to stock in a failing institution, and this conversion can happen over a weekend. It can happen without your consent, and it's completely legal under current law, because you're not a customer storing your property. You're a creditor who lent money to an institution, and creditors take losses when institutions fail, and the law treats this as fair and reasonable. But it goes beyond just bank deposits, because the same principle applies to other financial assets you think you own. And this is where most people's understanding becomes dangerously incomplete, because when you own stocks or bonds or mutual funds through a brokerage, you don't actually own those securities directly. They're held in street name by the depository trust company, and you have a beneficial interest in them, which is different from direct ownership. And in a crisis, when the system needs liquidity, when institutions need to be stabilized, these distinctions become very important because beneficial interests can be modified, they can be subordinated, they can be subject to restrictions and controls that direct ownership would prevent. And I'm not saying this will happen, I'm saying the legal framework exists for it to happen. And in financial history, everything that can happen legally eventually does happen when the pressure becomes sufficient. If this is starting to make you uncomfortable, if you're beginning to question assumptions you've held your entire adult life about the safety of the financial system, then you're paying attention, and you need to stay with me, because what I'm about to explain next is the mechanism that makes all of this not just legal, but inevitable. And if you understand this mechanism, you'll understand why subscription to this channel isn't optional if you want to protect what you've built, because the information we're providing here isn't available in polite financial media. It's not discussed by advisors who make commissions selling you products. It's the uncomfortable truth that you need to hear, even though almost nobody wants to tell you. The mechanism is called emergency powers, and it's the legal doctrine that allows governments and regulatory agencies to suspend normal rules during crises. And the definition of crisis is remarkably flexible, because a crisis can be a war, or a pandemic, or a financial system breakdown, or even the threat of a breakdown. And once crisis is declared, the powers that activate are extensive and frightening, because they include the ability to freeze accounts, to restrict withdrawals, to prevent the movement of money across borders, to requisition assets for public use, to modify contracts, to change the rules retroactively. And all of this is legal. It's written into existing law, passed by Congress, upheld by courts, because the legal theory is that individual property rights must sometimes yield to collective necessity, and in moments of genuine emergency, that theory might even be justified. But the problem is that emergency has a way of becoming permanent. Restrictions that were supposed to be temporary have a way of lasting for years or decades, and precedents set during crises have a way of being applied in non-crisis situations once people have accepted them as normal. Look at what happened during the Great Depression, when President Roosevelt declared a bank holiday in March of 1933, closing every bank in the country for 4 days, and people accepted this as necessary to prevent runs on the banks, to restore confidence, to stabilize the system, and it probably was necessary given the circumstances. But what came next was less clearly necessary, because after the banks reopened, gold ownership was criminalized, and citizens were required to turn in their gold to the government at a fixed price, and then the government revalued that gold upward, which meant that the government had confiscated wealth from citizens to recapitalize itself, and this was done under emergency powers. It was sold as temporary crisis management, but the gold ownership ban lasted for 4 decades, until 1974, and by that time, an entire generation had grown up never knowing that Americans had once been able to own monetary gold freely, and the precedent was established that in emergencies, property rights could be suspended indefinitely. The same pattern emerged more recently, during the financial crisis of 2008, when the government restricted short selling of financial stocks, when money market funds were guaranteed even though there was no legal requirement to guarantee them. When the Federal Reserve began buying assets it had no historical precedent for buying, and all of this was done under emergency authority, under the theory that extraordinary times require extraordinary measures, and some of these measures were probably necessary to prevent total systemic collapse. But the point is that once the precedent exists, Once people accept that rules can be changed midstream when authorities declare emergency, then the only question becomes what counts as an emergency. And that definition keeps expanding. Because if a pandemic is an emergency that justifies restricting movement and freezing certain assets, and if a financial crisis is an emergency that justifies converting deposits to equity, and if a threat to financial stability is an emergency that justifies capital controls, then eventually almost anything can be framed as an emergency if the stakes are high enough and the rhetoric is frightening enough. Now, let me connect this to your personal situation, to your retirement account and your savings and your plans for financial security, because this isn't just about abstract legal theory. This is about what happens to real people when these mechanisms activate, and the most likely trigger in the current environment is something called a debt crisis, because the United States federal government has accumulated $35 trillion in debt, which is roughly 125% of gross domestic product. And this debt is growing by approximately $2 trillion per year. And at current interest rates, the interest payments on this debt are consuming an increasingly large portion of the federal budget. And at some point, possibly quite soon, the mathematics become impossible, because you reach a point where interest payments exceed tax revenues, where new borrowing is required just to pay interest on old borrowing. And at that point, the system faces a choice. Default explicitly by refusing to pay, which is politically impossible and would destroy the dollar's status as reserve currency, or default implicitly by inflating the currency, by printing money to pay debts in dollars that are worth progressively less, which is politically easier, but economically devastating. But there's a third option that's less discussed publicly, but very much on the table in policy planning documents, and that option is to restructure the debt by involving private sector creditors, which is a technical way of saying force people who own government bonds to accept losses. And this has happened in other countries. Greece did it. Argentina did it. It's considered a normal part of sovereign debt restructuring. But here's what most Americans don't realize. You are probably a creditor to the United States government, even if you don't own treasury bonds directly, because your pension fund owns them, your mutual funds own them, your retirement account owns them, and in a debt restructuring, those bonds could be revalued downward, or they could be forcibly exchanged for longer-dated bonds at lower interest rates, or they could be subjected to a one-time wealth tax, and all of this would reduce the value of your retirement savings, and it would be legal. Because you don't own those bonds directly, your fund owns them, and the fund managers have legal authority to make decisions on your behalf, including accepting restructuring terms that reduce the value of your holdings. And this brings us to an even more concerning mechanism that's already being implemented in various forms around the world, and that's the concept of digital currency issued directly by central banks. Because once your money exists only in digital form, once there's no physical cash alternative, once every transaction flows through a central bank digital currency system, then the authorities have complete visibility into and control over your financial life, and they can impose restrictions that would be impossible with physical cash. They can prevent certain types of purchases. They can impose negative interest rates by making your digital money decay in value if you don't spend it quickly enough. They can freeze accounts instantly without court orders. They can implement capital controls that prevent you from moving money out of the country or even out of your local area. And all of this becomes technologically trivial once the infrastructure is in place, and that infrastructure is being built right now. The Federal Reserve has published research papers on digital dollars. Pilot programs are running in multiple countries. The technology exists, and the policy framework is being developed. And once it's fully implemented, the level of control over individual savings becomes total and unprecedented in human history. Now you might be asking yourself why I'm telling you all this, why I'm spending 20 minutes explaining legal mechanisms and historical precedents that paint such a dark picture of financial security. And the reason is simple. Because knowledge is the only real protection you have, because if you understand how these systems work, if you know what's legally possible, if you can recognize the warning signs when policies start moving in dangerous directions, then you have a chance to take action before the mechanisms activate, before your options narrow, before the emergency gets declared and the rules change overnight. And the people who survive financial crises with their wealth intact are never the people who trusted blindly. They're always the people who understood the system well enough to see what was coming and positioned themselves accordingly. And positioning yourself doesn't mean panic, doesn't mean selling everything and buying gold bars and hiding in a bunker. It means diversifying in ways that reduce your dependence on any single system. It means holding some assets outside the banking system. It means understanding that geographic diversification can protect you from country-specific policies. It means knowing the difference between owning an asset directly and owning a beneficial interest in an asset held by someone else. It means reading the fine print in your retirement account agreements to understand what rights you actually have and what rights you've signed away. And most fundamentally, it means accepting that the institutions you've trusted, the banks and the government and the regulatory agencies, they're not designed to protect your individual interests. They're designed to protect the stability of the system as a whole. And when those two objectives conflict, as they inevitably do during crises, the system will always sacrifice individual property rights to maintain its own survival. This is not a flaw in the system. This is how the system is designed to work, because systems optimize for their own perpetuation, and a financial system under stress will always choose mechanisms that preserve itself even if those mechanisms harm individuals. And this has been true throughout history. It was true when Rome debased its currency. It was true when medieval kings clipped coins. It was true when governments imposed capital controls during world wars. It was true in Cyprus in 2013, and it will be true the next time the United States financial system faces existential stress, which, given current debt levels and demographic pressures and geopolitical instability, could happen sooner than most people imagine. So what do you do with this information? How do you translate understanding into action? And the first step is to recognize that financial security in the modern world requires active management and continuous education, because the rules are changing, the risks are evolving. And what worked for your parents' generation, the simple strategy of working hard and saving money and trusting the system, that strategy is no longer sufficient in an environment where savings can be confiscated legally, where inflation can be weaponized as policy, where digital currencies can enable unprecedented control, and the only rational response is to become more sophisticated, more diversified, more aware of how power operates in financial systems. And that requires information, requires learning, requires staying ahead of policy changes, rather than reacting after they've already been implemented. I want you to think carefully about your own situation, about where your money is held, about who has legal control over it, about what would happen if the mechanisms we've discussed were activated tomorrow, because these aren't hypothetical scenarios. They're documented policies that exist in law right now, and I want you to leave a comment telling me whether you were aware of bail-in provisions before watching this video, whether you understood that bank deposits are legally considered unsecured loans rather than stored property, whether you knew about the emergency powers that allow suspension of normal financial rights, because understanding how many people are unaware of these realities helps us understand how much education is needed, how much work remains to be done to protect people from policies they don't even know exist. And if this information has been valuable, if learning these truths has changed how you think about financial security, then you need to subscribe to this channel immediately, because we're going to continue exploring these topics. We're going to show you specific strategies that protect against each of these mechanisms. We're going to interview experts who understand how wealth is preserved across different regulatory environments. We're going to translate complex legal and financial structures into clear explanations that empower you to make better decisions. And this knowledge isn't available in mainstream financial media, because mainstream media depends on advertising from the same institutions we're analyzing critically. So the information we provide here is rare, it's necessary, and it's designed specifically for people who understand that their financial future depends on their own awareness, rather than on trusting institutions that may not have their best interests at heart. The next video in this series is going to reveal something even more specific and immediately actionable. We're going to examine exactly what happened to retirement accounts during the last 3 major financial crises. We're going to show you which types of accounts were protected and which weren't, which assets held value and which collapsed, which strategies preserved wealth and which destroyed it. And we're going to give you a framework for evaluating your own retirement security based on historical patterns rather than on optimistic assumptions, because assumptions are what get people destroyed during crises, while knowledge and preparation are what allow some people to not only survive, but to actually build wealth when others are losing everything. So make sure you're subscribed, make sure notifications are turned on, and I'll see you in that next video where we continue pulling back the curtain on how money and power really work.